Take a minute to picture this. A country with a past rooted in the colonization of the New World. One whose geographic area spans an entire continent and is composed of diverse natural biomes, resources, and fauna. A country with a huge population holding relative dominance in the geopolitical affairs of its neighborhood. A country which champions democracy, but is hindered by corruption and political gridlock. A country with a diverse population of settlers who have opened their doors to immigrants from across the globe. A country which has a deep-seated historical relationship with slavery, but one whose path has been eternally guided by leaders who value order and progress. Brazil shares a lot of traits with the United States, but today, the US is a globally dominant economic and military superpower, while Brazil is a politically tense regional power with a disproportionately low amount of influence in global politics. So, how did this happen? Why didn't Brazil follow the same path as the United States to global dominance? And what if that had changed? This video is part 3 in an inter-channel series on Brazilian history and geography. You don't have to watch parts 1 or 2 to understand this video, but I'll be making some references to the other videos throughout this one. And I encourage you to check the links out in the description and the cards on screen to watch our other videos on the subject of Brazil after this one. So let's begin with a quick refresher on Brazilian and American history and a comparison between the two. Both Brazil and America were born out of revolutions against European monarchies. The difference between the two being that the United States established a republic in 1776 in the wake of their victory against the British, while Dom Pedro I of the House of Braganza declared not a republic, but the Empire of Brazil in 1822. While the United States focused on westward expansion in the 19th century, Brazil was determined to quell rebellions in the south, primarily the Cisplatina Rebellion in modern-day Uruguay. Both nations were simultaneously engaged in a vicious debate over slavery. In the United States, slavery was integral to the economy in the South until the American Civil War in 1861 brought its abolition. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the subsequent 13th Amendment in 1865 legally ended slavery in the United States, which caused a shift in the US economy to a wage-labor economy, promoting industrialization. In Brazil, slavery was much more entrenched, with the country importing more African slaves than any other nation in the Americas. Despite Brazil outlawing the African slave trade in 1826, slavery persisted until the late 19th century. Dom Pedro II played a crucial role in its abolition, ultimately leading the passage of the Lei Áurea, or the Golden Law, in 1888, which freed all slaves from Brazil. The trouble was, with the emancipation of slaves occurring so late in Brazilian history, the United States already had a jump start in adapting to the wage-labor economy and the new burgeoning industrial revolution. This is even in spite of the fact that both countries had those elements that would allow an industrial economy to boom. Abundant natural resources, a huge population, a vast land area which demanded railways to facilitate transportation, and raw materials like gold and silver, which could be used for capital investment. In both countries, leaders seized the opportunity to take advantage of those factors, but it was the United States which seemingly exceeded Brazil in its rapid industrialization. The US embarked on its industrial journey with the rapid buildup of factories on the East Coast, railroads which stretched out to the Wild West by the 1850s, and the development of urban centers in the Mid-Atlantic and California. Fueled by the principles of free enterprise and innovation, the country saw the rise of powerful industrial magnates like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. The advent of the assembly line by Henry Ford revolutionized production, making goods more affordable and boosting economic growth. An influx of immigrants provided a steady supply of labor, while a growing financial sector funded industrial expansion. The synergy between labor and capital investment propelled industrial growth, and the progressive era reforms under leaders like Teddy Roosevelt curbed corporate excesses and promoted fair competition. Then you have policies like the Sherman Antitrust Act and regulatory bodies like the Interstate Commerce Commission, which ensured a balanced industrial landscape. All in all, the United States concocted the perfect political environment for an industrial superpower. Then Brazil's industrialization was markedly different. Brazilian industrialization began in earnest in the very late 19th and early 20th centuries, much later than the United States. Initially, the economy relied heavily on agriculture, specifically coffee, sugar, and rubber. It's like how the southern United States was so focused on tobacco and cotton that they were unable to develop an industrial base. But this is the case all across Brazil, not just in one region. Following the abdication of the incredible leader Dom Pedro II and the establishment of the Republic in 1889, Brazil experienced significant political turmoil. Frequent changes in government, military coups, and political infighting hindered consistent economic policies and industrial growth. Then, as World War I reshaped global power dynamics, the United States seized the opportunity to become a world industrial power. The war effort boosted American manufacturing, propelling the country into a position of global economic leadership. In contrast, the promise of industrialization and modernization faltered in Brazil amid the aforementioned series of unstable governments and military coups. Unlike the United States, Brazil focused on internal repairs, played a minor role in the war, and did not capitalize on the power shifts during and after World War I, missing a critical opportunity to establish itself as a major industrial power in the West. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Brazil seized the opportunity as it presented itself and became an American superpower? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. Alright, so let's jump into this. The first thing we have to tackle is the fact that the road to industrialization and superpower status is far from a checklist that can be applied to every country exactly the same. Brazil and the United States are distinct in 5 particular ways that'll affect whatever path to prestige we take, those being size, colonial history, liberation, culture, and education. And I'm going to try to get through these differences as fast as possible so that we can get into the scenario itself. Of course, feel free to skip ahead past this part, but you just might lose some of the context. So in the early 18th century, Brazil's territory expanded significantly due to the treaties of Madrid in 1750 and Santo Ildefonso in 1777, adding vast tracts of land that were initially considered worthless by both Portugal and Spain. These lands, initially bought to be a buffer between Brazil proper and Spanish New Spain, suddenly gained new value with the discovery of gold, which led to a gold rush like the United States saw. The only problem being, the land couldn't be settled as effectively as California could be, because most of the gold deposits were just in the middle of the western Amazon rainforest. Brazil's settlements in and of themselves were immense, divided into captaincies, sesmarias, and engenhos. The smallest captaincy, San Vicente, was larger than any of the original American settlements, and many sesmarias were also bigger than some of the 13 colonies. Essentially, in Brazil, the abundance of land made it more valuable as a means of controlling power rather than an economic asset like it was in the United States, where expansion and land purchasing was gradual and driven by the need for more arable soil and resources. Unlike Brazil, where land was plentiful and cheap, land in the US held intrinsic economic value, driving settlers to claim and develop it rigorously. On the historical front, Brazil's colonial history was deeply rooted in a hierarchical, almost feudal-like system. Land was granted by the King of Portugal to trusted men, who in turn granted large tracts of land to lesser nobility or free men. The colonial enterprise in Brazil preserved the hierarchy, where land ownership was tied to duties and protection by the king's appointees, in an almost feudal system. The widespread use of slave labor, easily sourced from nearby Angola and the Gold Coast, was pervasive and brutal. By contrast, the 13 colonies were primarily settled by free individuals who formed homesteads and cities. The rule of law and a culture of self-reliance and mutual defense took root in the harsh American climate. Colonists interacted as free men, defending their properties and governing themselves, while the British were focused on other affairs, which laid the groundwork for American democracy and the American independent spirit. Slavery, while present, was geographically limited mostly to the southern colonies and less integral to the non-agrarian northern economy, which is what caused the divisions that sparked the Civil War in the United States. Brazil's path to independence, too, was relatively peaceful and marked by political maneuvering rather than the popular uprising like in America. The country became part of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves in 1808, gaining a form of de facto independence. However, when the Portuguese government attempted to revoke this status, Crown Prince Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence in 1822. Obviously, the United States, on the other hand, achieved independence through a protracted and bloody revolutionary war against British rule. This bottom-up approach to liberation embedded the Republican principles deeply into the nation's consciousness, and George Washington's humble and hesitant rule set the tone for America's relatively civil political climate throughout most of its history, rather than the upheaval of a monarchy and installation of a broken democratic regime in Brazil, which constantly stumbled due to corruption. In terms of culture and demographics, Brazil's population was a mix of native peoples, African slaves, and European settlers, creating a society with rigid racial and class divisions. The dominant Catholic faith, combined with a lack of emphasis on industrial work ethic, led to a culture whose aristocracy valued leisure and hierarchy over productivity and equality of opportunity. The landed elite, benefiting from the profits of large plantations and slave labor, had little incentive to promote industrialization or social mobility. And it was the same landed elite who overthrew the monarchy and installed the corrupt republic because they were angry over Dom Pedro II's abolition of slavery. The US colonies, on the other hand, were populated by a relatively well-educated and free populace, where class divisions were not as rigidly enforced, especially in the industrializing North. Influenced by Calvinist and Protestant ethics, American culture valued hard work, self-reliance, and community participation. This cultural foundation, coupled with the need to find competitive advantages beyond agriculture, especially in the resource-scarce northern colonies, fostered an environment conducive to rapid industrialization and economic development. Finally, there's education. Education in Brazil has historically been neglected, even to this day, with a significant divide between the elite and the general populace. Elite education, whether through selective public or expensive private institutions, was accessible only to a small segment of the population. This system is again rooted in the much more hierarchical top-down mode of Brazilian development throughout history. The aristocracy had no need to serve the people, and so they neglected to develop the lower classes. The United States placed a higher value on public education from its early years, seeing it as essential for a functioning democracy and a productive economy. The establishment of public schools and universities was driven by a belief in equal opportunity and the need for an educated workforce. So that was a lot. Hopefully you're still watching the video and haven't fallen asleep yet. Basically, we've got a lot of factors to juggle if we want to make Brazil a superpower, and we have a lot of baggage that we need to sort out. I'd say that in our alternate timeline, the main things we need to do to make Brazil a power that can rival the United States in terms of economic and political influence in the Americas are to 1. Abolish slavery in the early 19th century. 2. Install a ruler who cares about education and infrastructure and who can attract foreign investment to Brazil. And then 3. We need to give Dom Pedro II a male heir, or preserve the empire in some way. A smart emperor, whether Pedro II or someone down the line, with the support of a centralized army and the popularity of the people, can gradually replace the landowning elites with capitalists and industrialists. Well then, let's get into it. The year is 1830. As it becomes clear his reign is reaching its midnight, Dom Pedro I of Brazil revels in discontent. The Cisplatin War had ended in humiliating defeat just a year earlier, casting a shadow over his rule. The once unshakable confidence of the emperor had been eroded by the relentless tide of political unrest and economic strain. The landed elites, once his staunch allies, now whispered treasonous thoughts, seeking to force him from the throne. They blamed him for the war's failure, for the loss of the Cisplatina province, and for the nation's lingering wounds. It was a balmy night in Rio de Janeiro, the imperial palace cloaked in a heavy silence that foresaw the brewing storm. Emperor Pedro paced the grand halls, his mind a whirl of anger and contemplation. The elites thought they could control him, that they could dictate the future of Brazil, but they underestimated the resolve of the monarch who had declared the independence of this vast land. In July of 1830, in a crystal-clear act of revenge against the most powerful rung of Brazilian society, Dom Pedro declares the abolition of the slave trade and the freeing of all slaves in Brazil, just as Mexico and Chile had done only years prior. Pedro knew the consequences would be dire, but he saw it as his final act of defiance, a blow against the very system that sought to unseat him. The reaction was swift and violent. Across the vast expanse of Brazil, plantations erupted in chaos. Freed slaves rejoiced, but their jubilation was met with brutal backlash from enraged landowners. The elites, furious at their sudden loss of labor and power, rallied against the emperor's decree. Their whispers turned to shouts, and soon the country was ablaze with rebellion. Dom Pedro, as he had foreseen, was forced into abdication, but now he'd had the last laugh. On April 7, 1831, he handed over the throne to his son, Dom Pedro II, a mere child. A regency council was assembled, tasked with governing until Pedro II came of age. The regency was immediately thrust into a storm of chaos. Revolts had broken out across the country, each more severe than the last. In 1835, Rio Grande do Sul erupted in rebellion, a fiery insurrection known as the Ragamuffin War, which would smolder for years. Maranhão followed in 1839, its streets filled with the cries of revolution. São Paulo and Minas Gerais rose up in 1842. The Regency was stretched to its limits, desperately trying to hold the nation together. The council managed, just barely, to maintain a fragile unity. They quelled revolts with a mix of military might and political concessions, but the nation remained on edge. When Dom Pedro II finally came of age, the country he inherited was a far cry from the one his father had ruled. But, lucky for him and for the people of Brazil, Pedro II was an intelligent, calm, and crafty ruler. His reign was tested early and often, but he consistently proved himself capable of addressing his nation's problems. One of Pedro II's earliest challenges would be the continuing unrest in various parts of Brazil. Pedro took a strong-handed approach at quelling the rebellions, leading to a relatively peaceful period, until the Platine War approached his doorstep. Dictator Juan Manuel de Rosas of Argentina frequently encouraged dissension in southern Brazil, hoping to annex Brazilian territories. Pedro responded decisively by joining a coalition of rebellious Argentine states and Uruguay in 1852, militarily deposing Rosas and ensuring Brazil's southern borders. Perhaps in our alternate timeline, he goes further still, establishing a buffer state between Argentina and Brazil and expanding Paraguay's territory southeastward. Regardless, his confident hand in these internal and foreign affairs would earn him the respect of the Brazilian populace, and this respect would not go unreciprocated. Pedro II was a believer in a Napoleonic interpretation of aristocratic rule. He believed that rulers should rule and people should serve their rulers, but he also believed that the aristocracy should be intelligent and competent enough to be able to serve their country as well. This concept, which one might connect to the concept of the enlightened autocrat, greatly influenced Pedro during his developmental years when he was literally being groomed for a life serving as the Emperor of Brazil. Thus, Pedro's theory of governance meant that he had to improve life for the Brazilian people, as that was his duty as their ruler and the price for their allegiance to him. Pedro II's rule saw significant improvements across Brazil. Railways, water systems, paved roads, and improved port facilities transformed the infrastructure, facilitating commerce and communication, all of which we'll explore more in detail in a bit. Additionally, a reblossoming relationship with Great Britain provided Brazil with a vital trading partner, helping to stabilize the economy and promote growth. The Brazilian Senate and the elected Chamber of Deputies, however, did not subscribe to Pedro's model of enlightened aristocracy. Both houses of Brazil's Congress, mostly comprised of the landowning elites, controlled legislative power. Luckily, Pedro held a vague moderation power, allowing him to effect proposed legislation. In spite of his limited formal power, Pedro wielded considerable influence due to the divisions between political factions within the legislature. He used those divisions to play the elites against one another, all while pushing through his own reforms. The formative years of his reign, besides dealing with revolts and wars, would be focused on the economic issue. With slavery abolished, Brazil's agricultural economy had initially suffered. The abrupt end of forced labor created a void that threatened the nation's primary economic activities, and it'd take time to transition to a wage labor system. Drawing on the successful industrialization of other nations, he embarked on a comprehensive plan to transform Brazil's economy. In the mid-1840s, Brazil stood on the precipice of transformative potential. The nation was rich in industrial resources and had the capacity to far exceed the modest industrial growth it experienced in our timeline. To become a major industrial power, akin to, but perhaps not on the same level as the United States, Brazil needed to leverage its unique advantages. With vast reserves of iron ore, coffee, sugar, and rubber, Brazil possessed the raw materials which might be used in industrialization. However, a mere possession of resources was insufficient. The nation needed infrastructure to harness and transport the materials. In the United States, railroads not only served to connect industry to resources, but also became an outlet for investment and a producer of jobs and development. In Brazil, Pedro II would follow the trends as well, investing in railroad construction, which would peak by the 1870s. Railroads crisscrossed the country, linking resource-rich hinterlands with burgeoning manufacturing hubs in the southeast. Ports in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Santos were modernized to handle increased trade volumes, ensuring seamless export of manufactured goods. The next critical step was to include the kind of industry that was bringing the United States and Britain their riches, by embracing some new technological advancements. Advanced textile machinery, iron smelting processes, and steam-powered engines were imported and adapted to local conditions. New factories sprouted across the southeast, producing textiles, machinery, processed foods, and even early steel. One pivotal establishment was the metallurgical factory in Ponta de Area in Niterói, which produced steamships and machinery. Such facilities became centers of technological prowess, attracting skilled labor and driving further innovation. The last key to unlocking Brazilian potential was creating a favorable environment for capital investment. Drawing lessons from the United States, Brazil encouraged both foreign and domestic investments through a series of economic policies. The Alves Branco tariff, for instance, protected nascent industries from foreign competition, allowing them to grow and stabilize. Government subsidies and tax incentives were pivotal. Industrial establishments received grants and exemptions, and the remaining pockets of illegal slavery were ousted with force. Another aspect of rule Pedro focused on would be education. Education was integral to Pedro's life, especially during his early years. Unlike many monarchs of his time, Pedro II was largely self-taught. He mastered multiple languages, including Latin, Greek, French, English, German, Arabic, and Hebrew, and he had a wide-ranging interest in sciences, literature, and the arts. From his childhood, he engrossed himself in literature and learning, which is something many historians claim led to his incredibly effective and popular rule in our own timeline. As emperor, Pedro II understood the importance of the expansion and improvement of Brazil's education system. A thriving industrial economy, after all, requires a skilled workforce. Let's say, for the sake of our timeline, that industrialization and education become more widespread under Pedro II's rule than before, thanks to earlier changes we made with regard to the abolition of slavery. This would lay the groundwork for a new generation of industrialists and tycoons. By the late 19th century, Brazil would have undergone a remarkable transformation. The southeast had become a bustling industrial heartland, reminiscent of the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Minas Gerais emerged as key centers of production, driving the nation's industrial output. The southern region, particularly Rio Grande do Sul, mirrored the US Midwest, focusing on industries related to agriculture and food processing. All of this created a corridor of development that worked in Brazil's favor. Emperor Pedro II, despite his profound contributions to Brazil, found himself increasingly disillusioned with the burdens of rule. Like in our own timeline, age and a yearning for a quieter life with his wife in Europe began to weigh heavily upon him. However, one significant matter kept him anchored: the succession of the Brazilian throne. Isabel, his daughter, had served as regent during his travels and absences. Though well-meaning and compassionate, Isabel struggled to assert her authority against the powerful landed elites, who sought to exploit any opportunity to consolidate their power. During his European travels, Pedro II embarked on a discreet search for a suitable successor. The country needed a strong and decisive leader, one who could carry forward his legacy and protect Brazil from internal strife. His journey would lead him to Prince Friedrich Leopold, a member of the illustrious House of Hohenzollern of Prussia. His journey led him to Prince Friedrich Leopold of Russia, a member of the House of Hohenzollern. Friedrich Leopold, born on November 14, 1865, was the son of Prince Friedrich Karl of Prussia and Princess Maria Anna of Anhalt-Dessau. He was a man of noble lineage, steeped in the martial traditions of Prussia, and held strong conservative values. Pedro II would work behind the scenes to ensure a smooth transition of power. Upon returning to Brazil in 1889, Pedro II would announce his decision to abdicate in favor of Friedrich Leopold. The Prussian prince would be crowned the third emperor of Brazil at age 24. 2 years later, in 1891, Pedro II would die of pneumonia in Paris, France. With the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, Emperor Friedrich began to recognize the importance of strengthening ties to the United States. America could either be an asset or a threat to the Brazilian Empire. Thus, Friedrich took to both appeasing and collaborating with the United States in order to earn a seat at the table in the dictation of affairs in the Americas. Friedrich threw his support behind the US diplomatically and militarily. He began to build up the Brazilian Navy to strengthen their presence in the Caribbean. What resources were already available were rerouted to contribute to the American efforts in Cuba and Puerto Rico. By aligning with the US, Friedrich aimed to be the primary American collaborator in the Monroe Doctrine, which opposed European intervention and colonialism in the Americas. To further these contributions, Brazil actively participated in the construction of the Panama Canal, which would not only build their ties to the US, but could serve to benefit economic interconnectivity with Asia and the western ports of the United States. Despite occasional disagreements, such as Brazil's opposition to the US protection of the Dominican Republic during the 1905 Dominican economic crisis, and hesitance regarding US intervention in Nicaragua in 1909, the overall relationship between Brazil and the US grew stronger. The economic boom in the US under President Theodore Roosevelt positively impacted Brazil as well. Roosevelt and Emperor Friedrich would have a particularly cordial relationship with one another, given Friedrich's repeated interest in assisting the United States in their foreign policy goals in the Caribbean and Central America, but also due to the fact that both men were young, energetic, and active. With this relationship came an exchange of ideas that influenced Friedrich. He adopted some Rooseveltian policy stances, including conservation efforts in Brazil's many sprawling, beautiful, untouched swaths of land, creating for Brazil a national park service. Besides the United States, Emperor Friedrich Leopold forged another key alliance that would influence Brazil's future. As a German himself, Friedrich brought a strong focus on industrialization to Brazil. With this focus in mind, Friedrich forged early diplomatic and economic ties with the young and developing German Empire. Germany, having only unified in 1871, was in the market for strategic allies, and Brazil would become an early and strong supporter of Germany. The burgeoning relationship with Germany would pay off by the turn of the century, as Germany entered an age of industrial development unlike anything before on the European continent. From 1895 to 1907, Germany doubled the number of workers engaged in machine building, and overtook Britain in the production of steel. The partnership caused a slight increase in German immigration to Brazil, but after Germany's industrial miracle, the number of people leaving Germany had shrunk from 130,000 people per year in 1870 to just 20,000 in 1890, so the population exchange wasn't incredibly noteworthy. Nonetheless, the Germans who did arrive in Brazil tended to be industrialists seeking new markets or skilled laborers, which contributed to Brazil's industrial development. As all of this was happening, Friedrich was engrossed in the task of ridding himself of the remnants of the landed elites, which had burdened the previous two emperors of Brazil. His popularity abroad and his efforts in industrialization had strengthened the monarchy and weakened the agricultural industry, and by extension the elites, but their entrenched institutional power still posed a threat to Friedrich, just as Pedro II had foretold. Friedrich made attempts to fix this by promoting replacements in the Brazilian Senate and Chamber of Deputies, but they didn't always bear fruit, especially in the underdeveloped and primarily agro-resource-based Mato Grosso regions. Still, with the country being so far removed from slavery, the power of the elites wasn't absolute by any means. So, by 1910, Brazil was an industrial power, perhaps not on par with the United States, but close enough to be a credible influence in the political affairs of the American continents. With the advent of World War I, Brazil would find itself at a crossroads. Determined to maintain neutrality, Friedrich would aim to profit from the war by exporting goods to both sides of the conflict, much like the United States. The country's industrial sectors saw gains as it became an asset to the European powers by selling vital resources to the British, Germans, and Austrians. However, this neutrality was short-lived. The British grew increasingly unhappy with Brazil's assistance not just to them, but to their opponents. The British Navy would begin to intercept Brazilian ships headed for Germany, but not those headed for the British Isles. Now, obviously, that would make the Brazilians even more unhappy with the British in turn, and we'd see a significant diplomatic rift between Brazil and Great Britain as the British ramped up aggression, while Brazil was trying not to take a side and still profit off of the conflict. Up north, British propaganda would begin to sway American public opinion against Brazil, painting the empire as a supporter of the German Krauts. Although diplomatic relations between Brazil and the American government remained tense but stable, the American public grew increasingly wary of the Brazilian monarchy's involvement in the war, which, though Brazil wasn't necessarily a combatant, had an effect on Germany's performance. Even with the United States still on the sidelines, Brazil faced more mounting pressure from Britain. In response to the British aggression at sea, Brazil shifted its focus and became an industrial supplement to Germany's war effort, continually decreasing its aid to the British in turn. This move obviously did not sit well with Britain, thus the British Empire declared war on the Empire of Brazil for violating the Hague Convention, opening up a new front in the South Atlantic. Now Brazil found itself in a really precarious position. The nation could not afford to fight a war that might draw in the United States against them. To protect its interests, Brazil would continue to attempt to tie up the British Navy in the South Atlantic. Their successes would be bolstered by the fleet constructed by Emperor Friedrich, originally intended to secure the Caribbean with the Americans, but which would now be used to weaken the British blockade on Germany. With British attention diverted and split, the Germans would now have a window of opportunity for a naval resurgence. German U-boats would find themselves escorting Brazilian ships where possible. Leveraging its built-up navy, Brazil might not have achieved significant victories against the powerful British fleet, but Friedrich's fleet managed to ensure that crucial industrial exports reached Germany. The British would attempt to turn away as many ships as possible, but ships flying under false flags or the cover of fog still made it through, relieving the Germans with one crucial asset that they lacked in our own timeline: raw materials to fuel their war machine. As the conflict intensified, American public opinion shifted once again. Now the British were the aggressors against a neutral Brazil, and now support within the United States was waning for the Allies. Pro-war factions in America lost power as the public sentiment swung like a pendulum, and non-interventionists took the opportunity to show that the conflict was comprised of aggressors on both sides, and that America couldn't risk breaking ties with Britain or with Germany or with Brazil. In November of 1916, one of the closest elections in US history took place between Charles Evans Hughes and Woodrow Wilson. In our history, Hughes barely lost California by a margin of just over 3,000 votes. For the sake of this scenario, let's say California flips, causing Hughes to win the election. Charles Evans Hughes, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a staunch non-interventionist, would narrowly win the presidential election by 3% of the vote. Britain and France's worst nightmare has just come true. There will be no American entry into the war. The First World War would drag on to February of 1917 and would, by its end, have effectively become a naval skirmish as trench warfare bogged down both sides on the continent. The British put up a good fight, but a river of Brazilian industrial output flowed into Germany to supplement any losses the Germans faced, and a slowdown of American diplomatic and economic support crushed British morale and logistics. Germany, previously hampered by resource shortages, found new strength in a final push that would cause a diplomatic end to the war. The Peace of Cologne was signed months later, waving in a new era on the European continent. In the aftermath, we'd see a tributary state in Poland, an independent kingdom of Lithuania, and a Ukrainian state, all formed in the remnants of a Russia plagued by civil war and revolution. Germany would annex limited territory from eastern France and devised a border state of Flanders-Wallonia in order to protect against further French aggression. Brazil would be given French and British Guiana, and minor changes to borders in the African and Pacific colonies were drawn up. Austria would be given Serbia, and Bulgaria's territory would expand, but both states would be forced to turn inward towards the end of the conference, attempting to reorganize and reform to prevent revolutions in their multi-ethnic empires. The most damning of demands in the treaty would be the war reparations paid to Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, the crippled Ottoman Empire, and Brazil. Germany and Austria would obviously earn most of the reparations, though Brazil would find itself with enough cash to prevent a recession as the war machine slowed back down. Brazilian-US relations were on the road to recovery, while the European continent reordered itself and entered a new era and a new world order. And that's where we'll end this video for today. Be sure to watch parts 1 and 2 of our series about Brazil, and a special thanks to our Discord members Mocha, Hunter Galvius, and Leolas Pobre for their contributions to the latter portion of this scenario. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you really liked hearing about World War Brazil. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.